Well, welcome everyone to today's webinar on 3 shifts to turn momentum growth into strategic growth. Before we dive into today's content, I want to take a second and introduce our panelists. And if you've been on an Unstuck webinar before, this won't be any surprise to you, but it's always good to have Tony and Amy here with us. Tony Morgan, of course, is the founder and lead strategist here at the Unstuck Group. The Unstuck Group started back in 2009 and has now served more than 600 churches throughout the U.S. and several other countries of the world, most recently Costa Rica. Fun to be in Costa Rica. So that's Tony, and you'll hear from him in just a second. And then also my friend Amy Anderson. Amy has served as the director of consulting at the Unstuck Group since 2016. And during that time, she's helped well over 150 churches design ministry staffing and multi-site strategies just to align their team and fuel the mission at their church. Real quickly, here's why we're talking about this today. Our data shows that 2023 was a year of attendance growth for many churches. Some churches who were in that kind of maintenance phase or maybe even launch phase of the typical life cycle before the pandemic now find themselves experiencing things that look a lot like momentum growth again, riding that wave of momentum. Amy, do you agree with that?
Oh, I definitely agree. I've worked with so many churches this year that are actually growing, and momentum growth is fun. I mean, people start showing up, they're inviting their friends. New people tend to invite new people, so that momentum gets contagious. And it's as if the church can't do anything wrong. But every time the church opens their doors, and I'm hearing this from pastors all the time, they're saying, there were so many new people here again today, and I don't know their names, we don't know them. And that is really fun, right? Momentum growth is fun, but I'm really glad we're doing this webinar today because what starts out as kind of fun and energizing can quickly turn into a little bit of disorganized chaos if we don't have the right systems in place and just the right systems in place. And I'll tell you, it's not at all typical for churches to double in size in such a short period of time. But after the pandemic disruption, I think many churches have seen just significant growth over the last 12 months. And if we're honest, it felt really good after a lot of loss and pain in the last few years.
Yeah, that's right, Amy. It's been fun to engage with churches in recent months and just to hear the stories of not just attendance growth, though it's fun to hear about all the stories of new people connecting to the church. Mm-hmm. But more important than that, I mean, the number of stories I'm hearing from pastors about people crossing the line of faith, saying yes to Jesus, going public with that faith decision through baptisms. We're hearing more of those stories than ever, it seems. And yet, one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this today is because churches can get stuck in any phase of the life cycle. I wrote about this in my book, The Unstuck Church, back in 2017. There's no guarantee that you're going to have that momentum forever. And there are some specific shifts that need to happen to move from momentum growth to sustained health. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So the next step in the life cycle beyond momentum growth is strategic growth. And to get there, you have to let the momentum drive you forward to establishing new healthy systems and strategies. And that's what we're going to cover in today's conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do these webinars because we want to help church leaders drive towards helpful decisions within their church. And here's the decision we want to help you make today. If you've been experiencing momentum growth, we want to inspire you to commit to taking 3 key steps to leveraging that forward into that strategic growth season. So just to make it simpler as we go through the conversation, we're going to walk through it in 3 sequential steps. Step 1, focus on who you're positioned to reach. So focus on who you're positioned to reach. Step 2, identify future direction. And then step 3, develop the team and give leadership away. Last details before we get started, and then we'll dive into the bulk of the content and spend our time there. At the end of our conversation today, we're actually going to have live Q&A. So we invite you to submit your questions. You can use that Q&A button at the bottom of the screen in your Zoom window and submit those questions that come to mind and come up during the conversation today. And we'll try to get to all of those or as many as we can at the end of the webinar. If you haven't yet downloaded the workbook, you can get it at the unstuckgroup.com/workbook. So the workbook that goes along with the content here, the unstuckgroup.com/workbook. Our team, Tiffany, Jordan, Tony, and Amy will all be interacting on chat today. And I'd be identifying some of those questions for the live Q&A, but just kind of chatting with you as we go through this. Just a little bit of a spoiler if you haven't been on one of these before. We pre-record this content actually so that we can be in chat with you in conversation. So we'll be there in the chat room. Feel free to submit questions or just talk to us there. Anything that we can't get to, again, we'll try to follow up after today's webinar with either a blog post or some other content to answer those questions. And then last little detail before we get in, share today's conversation on X or Twitter, Twitter, whatever you want to call it, or Facebook at hashtag Unstuck Church. So sharing today's conversation on social media, hashtag Unstuck Church. So before we begin, we kind of want to dive into just understanding the life cycle of the church a little bit. So Tony, as we get to this conversation about the 3 shifts we want to cover today, could you just kind of give us a refresher on the typical church life cycle?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I wrote about the church life cycle in the Unstuck Church book, and what I wrote about, and that's been 5 or 6 years ago, it's even more evident in this current season that churches tend to land in one of these 7 phases. In fact, let me just throw up this graphic on the screen as I'm talking through this, but you can see every church starts in the launch phase, fun season. This is when we're just getting started, and pastors in the churches that are launching are hyper focused on reaching new people. Then you get to momentum growth, and that's really kind of the focus of our conversation today. And if you're in it, you know it, because it's almost as if every time we open the doors on Sunday morning, new people are showing up, and we're just riding that wave of momentum. But that momentum will not stick for the long run. You have to be intentional about moving to the next phase of strategic growth. And that's the key word. It's about intentionality around systems, intentionality around strategies, intentionality around structures. And we're going to talk about some of those specific shifts that you need to make to move from momentum growth into strategic growth. At the pinnacle of the life cycle is sustained health. And it's not a plateau. It's where the church is having maximum kingdom impact. And what really distinguishes these churches is multiplication. They're multiplying disciples. They're multiplying leaders that are engaging in ministry. They're multiplying the number of small groups, the number of people serving in ministry. And in many cases, it also results in multiplication of churches or congregations, either through multi-site or through church planting. And our goal at the Unstuck Group is to help as many churches as possible find sustained health and stay in sustained health for as long as possible. On the declining side of the life cycle are the maintenance phase, preservation, and life support. We're not going to give a lot of attention to those phases in today's conversation, but I will say when we look at the data of the churches that have completed the Unstuck Church assessment, the majority of churches land in maintenance, preservation, or life support. And so if that's your church, I hope today's conversations will be encouraging to you, because hopefully you'll begin to get a glimpse of the specific shifts or changes that your churches will need to make to get back to the healthy, growing side of the life cycle as well, because we want your churches to experience sustained health too. It was interesting during the pandemic. The pandemic obviously disrupted a lot of things in our lives. It also disrupted a lot of churches and the mission that we were engaging. But this is what we found as churches began to come out of the pandemic. Healthy churches before the pandemic, once we started to open up again as a society and more people started to come back to church, it's almost as if those healthy churches before the pandemic, the COVID days kind of accelerated their health, because on the other side of the pandemic, what we're hearing from many of those churches is we're seeing so many new people. Our church is growing so fast again, and we're hearing from churches they're kind of bumping up against growth barriers. And these are the types of conversations we used to have with churches 5 or 6 years ago. We're having a lot of those conversations again today. And I'll just tell you, I love engaging with churches around how to break through those growth barriers. On the same side of things, though, for the churches that were not healthy, the churches that were stuck, the churches that were in decline before the pandemic, unfortunately, what we're hearing from those churches is, again, the pandemic really did accelerate that decline. And so we have churches like that reaching out to us too, to figure out, what do we need to do? What are the big changes that we need to make in order to find health again? But hopefully, Sean, that quick overview of the church life cycle sets us up for today's conversation, which is really focusing more on those churches experiencing momentum today and trying to look at what are the next steps that we need to be considering to move forward. Because the reality is, no matter which phase of the life cycle that you're in, you can get stuck in any one of those phases. Wherever you are, there are some specific next steps that you need to be taking in order to experience more health and more kingdom impact. And that's where we're going to focus in today's conversation.
I think that is helpful, Tony. And I was just thinking as you were talking through that, I don't know if you could have convinced me even a year ago that we would be having momentum growth and strategic growth conversations with all that we've been through in the last few years. But it's great to have these types of challenges again that we're helping churches with. These are more on the fun side of the problems, but there's still challenges, right? And Amy, I wonder if you could just kind of zero in on what are some of the common challenges of momentum growth that you're seeing in churches that you're working right now that they're facing, and maybe how they're same or different than the pre-pandemic momentum.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I agree with Tony. The good news is that the backdrop of these challenges and momentum growth is growth. Mm-hmm. So while there's challenges in this phase, it's blanketed with more optimism because of the momentum. But I would say there's three primary challenges that I'm seeing churches face right now that are in momentum growth. And the first one is just this need for a refreshed or a new vision. People need the answer again to the questions like, where are we going? What are we rallying around? And, Tony, you and I have most recently been talking about this as more of the language of a bold move, right? Every church needs to define this, but especially in momentum growth, because having a fresh, renewed vision is actually a powerful way to harness all that momentum, because we're going to align everyone to move in the same direction versus dispersing all of that momentum and energy. And I think the biggest change we're seeing from pre-pandemic to post-pandemic is kind of the length or the brevity of the vision. In the past, I think churches often had 10-year plans where they were going. Today, we're thinking in shorter spurts with a more focused vision or a more focused, bold move. The second challenge I'm seeing is getting the right structure and responsibilities at the top of the organization. And so I would start actually with the very top with the lead pastor. In momentum growth, there really needs to be this shift in what the lead pastor is leading. Up until this point, the lead pastor is often involved in making a lot of decisions. They're in the know, sometimes in the weeds. And if that's not addressed, I think this can actually become the bottleneck for future growth. In this season of growth, Tony and I talk about this all the time. The lead pastor really needs to shift from being a part of all the many decisions to rather focusing on those four things that he or she can't delegate. And of course, to do that, the lead pastor needs to ensure that they have the right senior leadership team around them to carry the weight of those core ministry decisions. I think without the right leaders around the lead pastor, I don't know if you agree, Tony, but I think that environment can get toxic really quick, because this is where burnout can happen. And this was actually a big part of our story. The church that I served at in Minnesota, we definitely were in momentum growth. We were growing 20% year over year. And it became apparent, I'm grateful for the wisdom of our church board back then, that really helped our lead pastor get out of the weeds and into a different level of leadership. And there were 3 of us that were hired to serve under him. And we were good managers. And so we were able to help him stay in his seat and then actually lead the ministries. And it was a brand new day for our church. And really that was the bottleneck until we got there. So I don't think this challenge has changed, Sean, from pre to post pandemic, with just the exception that more churches are in this phase now than they were before the pandemic. Mm-hmm. The third challenge I see is a lack of systems, which is, Tony, you wrote about this so well in your book, but in momentum growth, because of the rapid growth, it's like suddenly cracks begin to appear in our systems. the systems that are really needed to be a healthy church. So cracks like, man, how do we engage and connect with the new people? That's a headline question I'm hearing all the time. How do we help people who are new to our church get connected, and how do we engage them? Or how do we help people step into serving more effectively? How do we develop new leaders? The answers to these questions, and many more than what I just said, they need to be defined in this stage, because if we don't define them, we will never drift into being healthy and connecting with new people beyond the weekend experience. You asked about kind of pre-pandemic, post. I think one observation in this area is the need to help people re-understand why these next steps are so critical for their spiritual growth. People's time and how they spend it. That was a growing concern pre-pandemic. In other words, maybe 10, 15 years ago, people were much more likely to start getting engaged in the church, but they weren't going to give their money towards it yet. They weren't going to give financially. We saw that trend, right, Tony, kind of flip. Maybe from 2015 to 2020, where people were now more likely to start giving versus giving their time. Well, the pandemic certainly poured gasoline on that one, and people's time, I think, has become much more guarded than ever. And most of the churches we're seeing in momentum growth, their serving numbers are down. They aren't at that benchmark of 50% anymore. Instead, they're hovering around 25 to 35%. So that's a big challenge for momentum growth in this season post-pandemic. And just to circle back then, and I'll stop here, but back to that first challenge of needing a newer, refreshed vision, people will give their time to something bigger than themselves. So if you find yourself struggling to help people re-engage in serving, just remember it's going to take more than an announcement to get them back in the game. They're going to need to be rallied around something to get involved.
Yeah. I think that's really helpful, Amy, and probably pretty affirming for a lot of the churches that are in momentum growth. They heard you describe some of those things, and they're probably feeling something very similar to that. So we're going to take just a second. We want to give you about 60 seconds and just reflect on what we just discussed. Think about the last 12 months of the life of your church, and answer this question. Are you experiencing any of these signs of momentum growth in your church? If not, maybe you identified more strongly with another phase of the life cycle. Just take about 60 seconds and either talk through that or think through it and then write something down, what phase that you think that your church might be in now, and then we'll come back with our first focus on our first shift. All right. Well, in the momentum growth phase, people often just show up. And I've talked to a lot of pastors who would say, we don't necessarily know exactly why right now. That's a common sign of momentum growth. And this has happened to a lot of churches after the pandemic. There's kind of this influx of new people. You're not exactly sure why, what exactly is bringing them to you. But in strategic growth, really, at that point, you've intentionally identified who has God called your church to reach in your mission field, and you're strategically finding ways to connect with and disciple them. Do you agree with that, Tony?
Yeah, it's absolutely important. And again, the thing about momentum, it's fun. We should celebrate it when we're experiencing it. But if we don't make some intentional changes in how we're engaging our ministry strategy, eventually that momentum is going to give way to stuckness. And so one of the earliest conversations we need to have with churches that are experiencing momentum growth is going forward. who are we intentionally focused on reaching and leveraging our reach strategy to continue to engage more and more new people. And so this is a conversation that we have with every church we serve, whether it's a single location church, particularly multi-site churches. We just want to make sure that we're aligned as a team about who specifically we're trying to reach within our mission field. So let me show you this chart. It kind of highlights some of the specific questions that we want to be asking as we're helping teams identify this person. So we want to know generally what age are they. We want to have conversation about where this person is currently as far as their spiritual condition. So again, this is not once they've connected to church and faith, but today, where are they? This is the person outside the walls of the church that may not yet have faith in Jesus. What is their current spiritual condition? And then we also ask about their current stage of life. And again, a lot of that is shaped by their age range, but we want to have clarity about who this person is that we're trying to reach within our mission field. And then for some churches, you can see there's some blanks in this chart. For some churches, we ask questions like the current financial condition, their education, and so on, so that we can really get focused on one person within our mission field that we're trying to reach. Now, why do we do that? It's not to create exclusivity. In fact, this is the crazy thing. What we've learned is the more focused churches are on a specific person that they're trying to reach within their mission field, the more intentional they get around their reach strategies. Then they become effective reaching that particular person. And this is what's crazy. Over time, they end up reaching a broad cross-section of their community. It's as if they're focused on one person, but they end up reaching everyone. The reverse is not true, though. What we've seen is that churches that try to do a little bit of everything for everyone within their mission field, those churches tend to have less overall kingdom impact as far as the number of people that they're connecting with and pointing towards Jesus. So the way I've described it, we're trying to be intentional about who we're trying to reach in our mission field, but not exclusive. So this is what I'd like you to consider here is, do we have clarity about who we're trying to reach in our mission field? And then once we have that clarity, do we know what's most important to that person? What are the opportunities that they're facing in their lives currently? What are some of the big decisions in front of them that they're wrestling with? What are some of the challenges that they're wrestling with? And as we get more clarity around that, that really does help us bring more intentionality then to the strategy that we're using to reach more people for Jesus. Without that, we can't move from momentum growth to strategic growth because, again, right now, we open the doors on Sunday morning, more new people show up. At some point, we know as churches move through the church life cycle, though, if they don't have that intentionality, new people will stop showing up on Sunday morning to engage in our services and then begin to take steps in their faith journey.
Amy, this is a really important, critical, but can be a challenging conversation for a lot of churches. How can they be sure that they're actually getting this right?
Well, one thing that comes to mind is, and it's something that we do when we lead churches through this, but to actually get some objective data in front of them, as well as their ideas, their subjective ideas around who should we reach, where's God placed our church, who are the people around us, to actually get something like a demographic report to confirm it. Because I think in our church, we can just get used to seeing the people who are in our church, and we think that's who's all around us. But I have so many churches, when they actually take a step back and look at who lives within a 20-minute drive time, they learn a lot of things. And, I don't know, Tony, if you mentioned this, but there's been a lot of demographic shifts through the pandemic. Yeah. I think about the church I've been working with in Durango, Colorado for, going on my third year. And with the pandemic and the influx of people from the West Coast moving to those places because they can work from home, it's shifting the information in those demographic reports. And so when I say that, I go beyond a good demographic report will give you information about age, stage of life, income, those types of things. We actually take it a step further and then actually look at some of those more, I don't know how I describe them, but the details of people, their life concerns is in our report. Reasons they go to church, reasons they don't go to church. What are the biggest headline issues that they're facing in their households? And so anytime you can get some objective data along with the opinions in the room, I think we'll get to a better place when we're selecting really who should we be reaching.
Tony, are there any kind of common mistakes that you see growing churches making when they're considering this specific shift?
Yeah, there are a number, but a few come to mind immediately, Sean. And one is just to piggyback on something Amy just mentioned. I think one of the common mistakes that we see is churches kind of get locked in to a person that they're trying to reach, and then demographic changes start to happen in their community. And so they lose sight of who's actually in their community, who's in their mission field. And they're not being, again, intentional about focusing on who is specifically in their mission field today. And what commonly then we see is sometimes they miss the need to focus on younger families, on single adults, or maybe there's ethnicity shifts that are happening within their community. And so opportunities to be more multicultural. But when you don't pay attention to the changes that are happening in the community, we've seen churches maybe miss the opportunity to make some changes in their reach strategy to continue to engage their mission field. A second mistake is we've seen churches that have gone through that part of the process, and no doubt they're hoping that they're going to reach more people in their mission field, and they're even praying that they'll reach more people in their mission field, but then they don't make intentional strategic changes in their ministry strategy. They're not changing their reach strategy to actually engage their mission field. And I just think, again, they're assuming that people will just show up on Sunday morning. And without that intentionality, that's not going to happen for the long run. And here, I think the biggest challenge is, and again, this is one of the common reasons why we see churches getting stuck, is they get married to the way that they're doing church currently, including Sunday morning services and other aspects of their evangelism or reach strategy. They get married to the way that they do church, and they forget why we're doing church, which is to actually reach more people, to help more people meet and follow Jesus. And so we have to not just have a clarity around who we're trying to reach and praying for that person, but we need to have more intentionality around our reach strategy. And then lastly, and I kind of referred to this earlier, one of the other common mistakes, and I get it, it comes from a good place in our hearts and our spirits. I know the change that God has, the transformation that he's brought to my life. And I want everyone to experience that. There's no doubt about it. But what we've seen is when churches try to do a little bit of everything for everyone in their community, they really don't ever get effective in engaging with people in their community. And it really reduces the potential kingdom impact that ministry can have. And so it's a bit counterintuitive, but we've seen it work time and time again. The more focused we can be, the more intentional we can be with our reach strategies, the broader the cross-section of people that we're going to reach in our mission field.
Before we move on to shift number 2, we'd like to ask you just to respond yes or no. You're going to see a poll show up on your screen, and just a simple answer, yes or no. And here's the question. Has your mission field experienced significant change in the last 3 years? So as you think about that community that God's placed you in, has your mission field experienced significant change in the last 3 years? Take just a moment, respond to the poll, and then we'll be back with shift number 2. Okay, so in this momentum growth season, you're riding the wave and enjoying that ride. And if your church has been growing kind of post-pandemic, that's such a huge blessing. It's been a breath of fresh air, I'm sure, and it is for us to see a lot of new people at church gatherings, and after all the growth during the pandemic, it felt like it kind of stalled out. In the strategic growth season, though, you've identified where God's called your church to go in the future, and you're intentional about leading the church to make bold moves in that direction. Tony, any thoughts specifically about that?
Yeah. So anytime you've been growing rapidly, you have more and more new people who are unfamiliar with your vision. And the vision, because of that, it needs to be refreshed periodically. And then we need to recast that vision on a regular basis because, and we've seen this happen time and time again, without a clear and compelling vision, people are going to fill in the gaps and begin to pull in different directions. And here's what we've seen is that, unfortunately, where there's a vision void, when there's not clarity around vision, when that vision's not being cast to the congregation, to the staff, to the leadership on a regular basis, the loudest person shapes the future direction of your church. And sometimes the loudest person is the most spiritually mature person, has the best clarity about where the ministry needs to go in the future. But unfortunately, many times the loudest person in the room is not necessarily the most spiritually mature and is the best person to know exactly the direction that the ministry needs to be going in the future. And that's why, as leaders in the church, we need to make sure we have clarity about where we're going in the future. We need to have alignment around that. We need to be unified behind that. And then we need to consistently make sure that that vision is in front of our team and in front of our church. So quickly, and we just in recent months have talked about this a lot on the podcast. So you could go back and listen to the series that we did on bold moves. But let me just share some what vision is and what it's not. Vision is a clear picture of where we're sensing God's calling us into the future. As Amy alluded to, the way we like to describe it is every church should have at least one bold move that they're sensing God has for their ministry that is going to help us think today about how we need to invest our financial resources, how we need to invest our leadership resources, where we need to engage the servants, the volunteers in our ministry that are helping move our mission forward. And that bold move is going to look different for every church, but there should be real clarity about we're here today, but we're sensing God has this bold move for us that we need to be pursuing in the months ahead. And so mission is not a vision. Mission describes why we exist, our purpose as a ministry, but vision is a clear picture of where we're sensing God's taking us in the future. Values, that's not a vision. And we've seen a lot of great churches define great values around the authority of God's word, about prayer, about how they're engaging and connecting people into the church. All of that is good, but it's more a value that you hold as a ministry. It's not a clear picture of where you're sensing God's taking your church in the future. And vision is not a strategy. Strategy is how we're going to accomplish the vision, but it's not that clear one bold move that is going to rally our church, rally people's time, rally people's prayer, rally financial resources. We need to have that as a ministry in order to really almost challenge us or push us or cause us to get to an uncomfortable place where we're relying on God to help move the mission of the church forward. And with that, one of the conversations that we like to have when we're on site with churches talking about future vision is around potential God-sized dreams. And this is the chart. I've purposely left it blank for today's webinar because this conversation tends to go in a lot of different and unique directions with every single church that we work with. And this is a fun conversation because we're dreaming, we're praying together about what God might have next for each church's ministry. And it's not uncommon for us to fill this entire chart with potential God-sized dreams. and then have to pull out another blank chart to continue that conversation. And of course, we can't run after all of those potential God-sized dreams, but part of what our team does then is to try to narrow all those great ideas down to maybe just one or two key bold moves that we're sensing God has for a church. And then not just to have that clarity about where we sense God's taking the ministry, but then to map out specifically over these next 12 months, what are the key priority initiatives that we need to accomplish so that this vision actually becomes reality. So it's a fun conversation. And again, Amy and I talked a lot about how we help churches define vision, to define their bold moves in that previous podcast content. But this is certainly one of the key shifts that churches need to make, get clarity around vision if you're going to move from momentum growth into strategic growth.
Yeah, so if listeners are interested, jump back to episode 320 on the podcast and start from there, and you can listen through that series. Amy, I wonder where you see churches have blind spots or maybe get stuck when it comes to working to identify their future direction.
Yeah, I think just by its nature, for many of us, I think that task just feels overwhelming. I'm certified in working genius, and so you guys know this about me. If I have to do wonder or invention, I can kind of freeze up. But if you start writing something down, I can make it better. And so I think one of the biggest mistakes or sticking points is when the pastor or people around the pastor feel like he has to or she has to come up with this future direction all on their own. While there needs to be someone with the decision rights and the ownership of it, really this is a team-based activity. And the diversity of people that you can bring around, the different viewpoints, the different ideas, it's with a team of people. And so, one of the things that we do when we prep people for the vision conversation is we ask them, like, pretend you're 3 or 4, whatever the time frame is, years out. What did God do through your church? And then we have them think through, like, what will be different about our church in 3 to 4 years? What's going to be different about our community in 3 to 4 years? What might God do if we really believed he could? So when you prep team members with questions like that and then gather them all, and then like Tony, like you said, with a chart like that to gather it, there's a lot of energy and wisdom that comes out from it. And I hope that just feels, for any of you that feel like, oh, vision feels like this big mountain I can't climb, a simple start like that, it is just amazing what can happen in an hour around a conversation like that. And then the other thing that comes to mind for me is understanding what God's already done through your church is a really great backdrop to thinking about what he might do next. One of the things that we do with a church is it's called the Church's Story Timeline. And we get, again, 10 to 12 people in the room, and they just tell the story of the church, the highs, the lows. When did we have momentum? When did, momentum fail? Why was that? Where did we take the most risk? When were we the most united? And it's just recapping the story. And Tony, I don't know if you experienced this, but it's really helpful for the new people that have come onto your team over the years and they don't know the church's story. And so they get to hear and fill in the blanks and understand more about their church. But also when you step back from that story, you can see God's hand and what he was doing. It's the only time in our process we look back, but I'll liken it to my husband. When he turned 50, I bought him a life plan, and he spent 2 days telling his story, going through charts. And when he stepped back from his story timeline, he just recognized every time God had something, a call that was just out of reach, that's when he did his biggest work. That's when God showed up the most. And so reflecting on that story, I think it would be really helpful to get your team aligned around the story, aligned around the learnings. And I think that will also help prime the pump for vision conversations, or at least inform it.
Yeah, that's very good. And just to kind of kickstart that, we want to, before we move on, give you just about 10 or 15 seconds. And each of you individually, if you're watching this on your own, that'll be fine. If you're watching it with a team, do this on your own. But jot down just a God-sized dream for the future that you've already been kind of holding on to in your heart. Okay, so just one thing, God-sized dream that you've been considering about for the future of your church. Take just 10 or 15 seconds, and then we'll come back with step 3. All right, step number 3, we're going to focus on developing the team and giving leadership away. In this momentum growth season, most decisions are made by a few people, honestly. And even in large churches, the crisis season we were just in forced leadership into fewer people's hands, really. If you've experienced a lot of growth in the last 12 months, it's time to take a look at your team culture and your structure again. In the strategic growth phase, you've clearly defined the culture of your team, and then you're empowering people to lead at all levels of the ministry. Amy, any thoughts you would add to that?
Yeah, so Sean, when we're trying to develop the team and give leadership away, fundamentally, we have to go back to making sure that we've been clear as a leadership team about where we're going. And it starts with that vision. In fact, you've all seen this before, our strategic alignment pyramid, but it's really foundational to actually getting to that end result of giving leadership away. And so if this is new to you, there's a foundational level of this pyramid, there's a directional layer, and there is an action layer. And so there's the foundation, and we're not going to get into that today, but most churches have that defined. But this direction level, the second level in there, these are the things that the senior leadership needs to make crystal clear for the organization. They need to bring clarity to where are we going? That's the vision or the bold moves we've been talking about. What does success look like, right? What are the goals for our ministries? If we do what God's calling us to do, what will the results be a year from now? The strategy question, so how will we accomplish those goals? And then we have to have the right structure. When those pieces are in place, that actually enables us to get to the top level of the pyramid where ministries have clarity about how their priorities fit into the overarching goals of the church. And then the people in those ministries understand what they're accountable to. And so a couple of things as we develop this team, the structure piece obviously has been a hot topic this year. But when churches are in momentum growth, I'll just share an example of one org chart that I stumbled into. This is a church that's definitely in momentum growth. Not only are they in momentum growth, but they expanded to another location. And they maybe did it a little early, but God called them to go and they went. And so they have 2 locations. So at the top of this org chart, they all are wearing many hats. So it might just say campus director, location 2, but this person is also overseeing a lot of the things in discipleship. So it might look neat and orderly, but this is an example where as the church grew through momentum growth, they just kept adding people and really who can lead them? Who has capacity to take this on? So it's not unusual for me to see an org chart messier than this one even, where it's kind of just designed around who had capacity to lead, or it was built around that leader, like that leader understands communications. Even though they're our youth director, we'll put communications under that person. And so all that to say in momentum growth, we need to pause sometimes. We already talked about the systems that need to be created, but we also need to pause and evaluate, is our structure aligned now to this vision of where we're going? Where do we need to clean up ministry lanes? Tony, we've seen this where people really aren't leaders in leadership positions. Do we have the right people in those seats? Once you align that structure, now you can jump to the top part of that pyramid to make sure every ministry leader understands how they link to those mission goals. And once that's in place, you can delegate now. You've brought clarity to what success looks like for your role, and you can empower leaders to go and lead. So those are probably the most foundational, critical pieces that need to be in place in order to develop the team and actually give ministry and leadership away.
Tony, could you share some of those kind of significant staffing and structure priorities churches need to have if they want to shift from momentum growth season into strategic growth?
Yeah, so 3 come to mind. One, you could call it the shift from me to we. In other words, it's not unusual for churches that are in launch or momentum growth. It's the senior pastor that is kind of the primary leader and catalyst for that initial growth and health in the church. But as a church gets to momentum growth, and then you're looking ahead to next steps, you have to shift to more of a team-based approach for leadership. And that begins with the top of your staffing structure. And so it's really moving from solo leadership to team leadership. And Amy alluded to this a bit ago, but it's getting that right mix of leaders around you so that as a team, you're owning the mission. You're owning the strategy for how you're going to engage that mission. And it's shared leadership responsibility through the rest of the organization, including staff and volunteers. But you have to make that shift from me to we. Second shift, you have to shift from doers to leaders. And those first two kind of go hand in hand. But again, when the church is smaller, you're just looking for people that are, number one, willing to show up on Sunday morning, but then secondly, willing to help out someplace. And initially, that's how churches start to experience momentum. And it's not unusual in that season because there's so much growth happening. We're trying to fill so many volunteer and staff roles. We're really looking at who's available rather than who's gifted to lead for some of these roles. And as the church grows and gets into momentum growth and more people show up and the teams get bigger, we really need to be looking for not just can someone do the job, but can they lead the team that does the job? In other words, do we have some people that know how to build teams and get ministry done through other people? And so we need to shift from hiring doers to hiring leaders. And then thirdly, we need to begin to shift from hiring generalists to hiring specialists. And it's interesting. I was just with a great church, and this was, they've gone through a season of momentum growth, and they're certainly in those first steps of strategic growth right now. But one of the things that I was helping them look at is when they hired in the past, they hired people that loved Jesus, that loved the church. They were great leaders, but they were the type of people that were willing to jump in and help wherever help was needed. And that's, again, a great attribute to have when the church is smaller and it's like all hands on deck for almost every Sunday and everything that the church is doing. However, as the church grows and as the team grows and we're starting to step into strategic growth specifically, we need to move from having generalists that are just willing to help wherever they can help to having people that really have a specialized knowledge. They have wisdom to move specific aspects of your ministry strategy forward. So it really involves having more specialists around weekend services, around our reach strategy, around spiritual formation and discipleship, around what we're doing to help kids and students take their next steps towards Christ, operations, and on down the line. We need to have specialists, leaders still, but they can specialize in their area of ministry to help move the mission of the church forward. So 3 shifts: the shift from me to we, the shift from doers to leaders, and the shift from generalists to specialists.
All right. Well, this has been a really helpful conversation on that shift from momentum growth to strategic growth. I want to get to live Q&A here in just a minute, but Tony, before we go there, any final thoughts from you?
Well, first of all, I mean, when the pandemic initially hit, and I try to forget those days, just to be honest, but I do recall that in that moment, I was just praying that God would intervene and really use this as a moment for the church to have greater impact in the lives of people. And it's just fun now, this many years later, to look back at how God used what was an awful season for many people's lives. And out of that now, we're hearing from so many churches that are experiencing health and the stories of new people connecting with the church, new people connecting with the faith. First of all, I just want to say thank you, Jesus, for that, what you've done through a crisis situation like that. But then secondly, I mean, for Amy, me, the team at the Unstuck Group, I know a lot of your churches are experiencing some of this momentum now. And this is what we absolutely love to do, is to come alongside ministries like yours that you're doing so much great ministry now. But to help you keep that momentum so that you can continue to grow, reach more people for Jesus. I hope you know enough about us now to know we're not about big church. We're about healthy church, But when the church gets healthy, man, we want you to reach more people. So it's been a fun conversation today, Sean. This is the type of stuff, again, I just absolutely love to do because it's what God's called me to do. The more we can help point people to Jesus, the more that they can experience the fulfillment, the purpose, the forgiveness, all that God has for them. That's where people's lives are healed, but that's also where communities are healed as well. So I love being a part of this mission.
Tony, Amy, great conversation. I think really helpful content and good conversation in the chat and Q&A. So we're going to just move into that live Q&A now. And some good questions come in. I think this will be a good conversation for us. Tony, if it's okay, I actually want to start with a mission field conversation. Interestingly, our mission field poll that we did during the webinar, 54% of the churches or the church leaders responded that their mission field had experienced significant change in the last 3 years, which maybe is not surprising, but confirming for what we thought, right? We've seen that and we've experienced that.
It is. Again, the church I was just with yesterday was talking about the transition that's happening in the community. This is a community up in the Midwest. And it's amazing to see how much shift there has happened. People moving to the area, people moving to other parts of the country. As a result of that, the church is rightly so just stepping back in the season and asking, our mission field has changed. Who are we, again, trying to reach in our mission field? And specifically, how can we help begin to point people to Jesus and connection to faith through the church? So it's an important conversation right now. And again, more than half the churches responding like that does not surprise me. Really, every church probably needs to be reassessing where their mission field is today and how effectively the church is at trying to engage with the people they're trying to reach.
Yeah. So Joe asked this during our webinar. He said, and this seems like a great thing for their church. We have a new housing development being built across the street from our church that's going to include around 800 homes. Is it enough to say that this new community will be our target, or should we get more specific within that neighborhood? How would you answer that?
Well, I just believe God's called us to the place where he's called us. And so if God's bringing 800 new families to your community, my goodness, that is your mission field. So be focused on who you could be reaching in that community. And I love the heart behind that question because that you can tell. I mean, this is somebody who just believes God's called them to the mission. They're almost like missionaries in their community, as opposed to, unfortunately, too many times I think churches kind of get stuck in a rut. They continue to do ministry the way they've always done ministry. And it becomes more about how they're doing church rather than who are we trying to reach in our community. And so I'm thankful for folks like Joe that have that missionary mindset.
Absolutely. Amy, I want to throw this one your way. One of the leaders that was tuned in today to the webinar said, I agree that strategy is needed, understanding who's going to do what by when rather than everybody doing their own thing. Do you have any suggestions for managing and communicating that needed change for their team and for their team specifically?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would go back to that strategic alignment pyramid that's in your workbook and really work with the senior leadership team to make sure that you've done your part correctly, that you've brought clarity to those steps of where we're going, what success looks like over the next year. And those are just some key metrics, right? And we like to talk about having both reach metrics in there and discipleship or spiritual formation. So it's things around in-person attendance, number of people that said yes to Jesus or that got baptized. On the spiritual formation, the number of people involved in serving or in groups. And a growing critical one is how many volunteer leaders do we have? Anyways, putting a picture to what success looks like for the organization is so important. And then that the senior leadership team has agreement on the core ministry strategies that are actually going to accomplish those goals are important. And then, of course, structure has to be there. But when that's in place, then everyone on the team should report to one of those senior leaders, right? In the organizational chart. So it's up to every one of those leaders and managers to bring clarity to the ministries under them, what success looks like for their ministry this year. And they have decision rights with that, right? It's a dialogue between an employee and a manager, but they're going to have oversight of how that ministry is executing. and then helping staff members realize what are the things that I need to be doing that are going to affect those goals. So just for example, on that volunteer leader one, if I'm the student leader, I should know, oh, you're expecting me to have 10 new volunteer leaders. Well, that's going to impact how I spend my time because I've got to be across the table from people and inviting them into ministry. So when that directional level is set, it should keep you all moving in the same direction and really minimize anybody going rogue and spending time on things that they shouldn't be. And of course, some of this just boils down to good management as well. I mean, if you've got the directional level set, then you need to have good managers who are helping people understand where they're winning and where their gaps are.
Let me piggyback that question, Amy, with another, and then I want to get to a question on churches that are primarily leading through volunteers. How soon into growth do you recommend hiring specialists and not just generalists?
Oh, interesting. Tony, you might have a different opinion, but there are certain sizes we know where certain roles come into play. A big part that stands out to me is at that 1,000 mark. That's typically where we bring in like an executive pastor who can now be really the person who's helping integrate the vision through all of the employees. It's also at that point where a specialist that comes on board is someone for your database, because good information in, good information out type of thing. And especially in your family ministries or your spiritual formation, those are the areas where you really want to focus on those multiplying, equipping leaders, those Ephesians 4 leaders who are going to engage the body in the work of ministry. Those are critical because you can't keep hiring more and more staff as you grow in those areas, because the other areas of operations and like the worship or the gathering side, that's where you do need specialists. You need specialists in accounting. You need specialists who can play a guitar, who can run audio. You need specialists in the communications area and the digital area. And so you need to reserve staffing dollars in those specialist areas so that you've got leaders in the family and the discipleship areas. Anything you'd add to that, Tony?
No, I mean, it has to do with moving from momentum to strategic growth, but the size of the church also is going to impact that decision. And that's why when we're working with churches through mission, vision, strategy, we always then circle back to take a look at staffing structure as well, because the answer to that question is going to really look different for every church that we engage with.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Let me ask this kind of both of you, and Tony, maybe you can take a first crack at this, but then thinking about churches that have fewer staff. They don't have necessarily staff to lean into. They're leaning into a larger group of lay leaders to help move ministry forward. Are there any differences in what strategic growth looks like in those churches, or how those churches should approach moving from momentum growth to strategic growth?
Gosh, I don't think so. I mean, it's still about intentionality around who we're trying to reach, how we're reaching them, where we're going in the future. It just may be that the people that are helping to lead in certain key areas, core areas of ministry, are key lay leaders rather than paid staff leaders. But the principles are still the same, Sean.
Mm-hmm. Anything you'd add to that, Amy?
No, he's spot on. I totally agree.
Perfect. A great really cool.
By the way, it's always fun when Amy Anderson agrees with you. That's just
it's true.
That just made my day right there.
We should probably end there, but we're not going to. I got another good question. Our church. So Joel asked, our church's attendance is up 27% year to date. November was 82% above where November a year ago was. So phenomenal experience at Joel's church. We need to refresh, recast our vision. What are the most effective ways you've seen for sharing and casting vision? Tony, you want to take the first stab at that?
I can't, in the 30 seconds that I have on how to cast vision, I can't do it. I do know that we have a great resource that we've pulled together on casting vision for your church. And so maybe in the follow-up, Jordan from our team can include that as a link so that you can have access to that resource. But let me just say, for senior pastors and lead pastors, we said it during the webinar a little bit ago, you need to have clarity on where your church is going in the future. You need to have clarity around that bold move. And one of your key We call it one of the core 4 responsibilities for you as a senior pastor is to be the primary vision caster for your church. And we say that over and over again because you need to be talking about vision over and over again. This is part of what your church needs from you to maintain unity, to maintain alignment so that you can continue to accomplish the mission God has here in ministry. So great question. And we'll try to provide the resource for you so that you're able to, look.
It's already there.
Jordan already
Jordan's
provided
good.
a link, but we'll also include that in the follow-up communication.
Absolutely. So we just have a few more seconds. So if you need to grab that link, hit that link real quick because Zoom will close out. Of course, we'll be sending out the replay of this webinar, so you'll have access to the conversation and all the resources. We'll send that out to you soon. You can continue the conversation on social media, hashtag Unstuck Church on Facebook or X Twitter. We'll try to respond to all of the questions we didn't get to in some kind of follow-up content. And of course, if we can do anything to serve you and your church, you can reach out to us at theunstuckgroup.com. Thanks for joining us today. We'll see you back on a future webinar.